It's so fun for me to be a part of the alumni weekend. I've been at Anderson for 9 years now. I'm trying to see, in those 9 years I've realized I need glasses. So I can't tell who in the audience I've had before, but I've loved my time here and I hope that it's fun for you all to be back. So as Jill said, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my book that's coming out in a month. And I'm gonna start by talking about a guy that I got to talk to in writing the book. This guy, his name is Greg Tietz. Back in the 90s, he was an entrepreneur, like a small entrepreneur in the Midwest. Things were going pretty well, but he decided that he wanted to make a change in his life. This may sound familiar to some of you. He decides to move. He moves to the Bay Area and gets a job. Is anybody from the Bay Area? Okay, so I guess we know our demographics here. So he gets a job at the bottom of the hill. This is this club. It's like a music venue, and he's staying up late at night. He's sort of doing everything, like bartending and event planning, and he's a bouncer as well. And then he has one day off a week. And on those days off, he decides to explore a new neighborhood in the city. Now, one thing to tell you as context here is that around this time, I think he's in his mid-20s, he's in the market to get his first tattoo. He knows he wants a tattoo. I'm just telling you that because on one of his days off, he decides to explore the Mission, and he walks, if you don't know the area, there's all these little burrito joints there, these little restaurants, and he walks by one of these restaurants, this little burrito spot, and there's a sign up right over the door, and next to the logo of the restaurant it says, "Tattoo me on your body and get free food for the rest of your life." Okay, that's how I felt when I read about this. Just in case you're curious, this is what the tattoo, or the logo, I should say, would look like. By the way, this is Casa Sanchez. I don't know if you've heard of them. They actually make food now in grocery stores. So Greg sees this and thinks, this is really appealing. It's really creative. It's interesting. But wait, you think, maybe I'll do this. Before you do that, what's the first thing you want to do before you decide to do this? Try the food, right, exactly. Okay, so it'd be kind of silly. So he goes in, he has a burrito, he says it's pretty good. Next day, he gets the tattoo. Now, when I first heard about this, I have to tell you, and maybe I'm too risk averse, but when I first heard about this, I was like, oh shit, this could be really bad, right? That could be a decision that you would one day later regret. And that's not to say that tattoos are regrettable. In fact, most of them are not. Except for the ex-lovers and the ones that sort of stretch in funny ways, but most of them are not, okay? But when I read about this, I thought this could be a problem. This could be something he would regret. And this is sort of funny, but it's sort of representative of a lot of the things that I study, which is essentially decisions that we make when we eventually screw over our future selves. So when I study it, I look at things like we undersave and overspend, and we overeat and underexercise, these sorts of things. But there's other more pernicious ones that I don't think are so common or so sort of easy to come to mind. Like, for example, sometimes we spend too many hours at work and not enough time on the things that may matter later on. Or we focus, this one, you focus too much on the urgent and not enough on the important. And these are all things that matter over time. And in this particular example, I thought, here's a case when we're making one of the mistakes that I study, which is that we anchor too much on the present and project it ahead to the future, failing to consider how things might be different later on in a way that we will later not really appreciate. So over the years, I've really been spending my time doing my research here at Anderson, trying to understand why we do this so much, why it is that we make life so difficult for our future selves. The answer, or the idea that I hit on, was really inspired by a lot of philosophers. And it has to do not with anything all that crazy, but it has to do with how we travel through time. Okay? I would bet that most of us, when we think about it, think that you're sort of one person over time. You are who you are. But when you start to think about it, that may get challenged. That idea might get challenged. You start to realize, well, you might live in a different place. All right, that's just surface level. But maybe you have different friends, and your values and preferences might have changed. And then all of a sudden you start realizing your name might have changed. If you're in LA, your nose might have changed. There's all sorts of things. That was too easy, I'm sorry. So there's all sorts of things that may have changed. And so when we start thinking about our future selves, I know this one's a little depressing to me too. When we start thinking about our future selves, philosophers have said that maybe a better way to consider who we are over time is not one person, but rather a collection of separate people. And I know that sounds sort of bizarre, right? But the idea is that the analogy I like to use is imagine a workplace where you've got a lot of people sort of oriented toward the same goal. You can think of a new startup. Maybe there's not that many of you, but there's a bunch of you. That's how I think of identity over time, except rather than a bunch of people at one workplace, you're a bunch of people over the span of your life. So Derek Parfit, he's one of the philosophers who've talked about this, and he had this line where he said, think about a young boy who starts to smoke, knowing and hardly caring that this may cause him to suffer greatly 50 years later. That boy doesn't identify with his future self. It's almost like the future self is a stranger. I got really into some of this British philosophy. This was during a particularly lonely period of time in grad school. I was reading these journals, but then I had something else that was a little funnier. I came across this bit where Jerry Seinfeld talks about the same thing. And he says, I never get enough sleep because I stay up late at night. I'm night guy. What about getting up after 5 hours of sleep? That's not my problem. That's morning guy's problem. Which I assume everybody relates to this, right? And then he has a solution where he says, the only thing that morning guy can do is just try to oversleep often enough so that day guy loses his job and then night guy has no money to go out anymore. Which is exactly right. Now, there's a difference here, right? The philosophers are talking about these long-term spans. In my research, I look at ourselves over time, especially when it comes to retirement and other sort of health decisions that spread out over time. Seinfeld, he's talking about at night to morning, but there's the same idea there, that there's this separation of selves. Now, it's not just theory, I should say. There's some data that suggests this as well. So one of my favorite studies asked people to think about their birthday this year. All right? They said, write down the scene in front of you. Write down the scene of what your birthday looks like. You can probably think about this right now, all right? What are some of the things that come up in your mind when you think of your birthday this year? Go ahead, just shout it out. Family, okay. Cake, presents. No one says drinks. I would have thought drinks would have been the first thing, but you're being very PG here, Jill. Okay, so cake, family, presents, drinks, those are the same things, right? Everybody says that. They have a scene in front of them like that. Now, these researchers ask a different group of people. They say, write down your birthday, but now write it 20 years out, 30 years out. People write about the same stuff. There's presents, there's cake, there's friends and drinks. But there's one difference. When people do this in the distant future, they're more likely to adopt the third person perspective. They see their future self in the scene as if it's another person. Now, not everybody does that, but a lot of people do. My own research backs this up. We did a neuroimaging study showing that in the brain, the activity that comes out from thinking about another person is more similar to the activity that comes about when we think of our future selves. So our future selves look like another person. All right, so the reason that this matters, I know I've been saying all this stuff about future selves being other people, but the reason that this matters has something to do with the way that we treat other people. I want you to think for a second how you would respond if a coworker, just think of a coworker for a minute who you're not friends with them. It's not like you hate them, but you're not great friends with them. And they come up to you in the break room and they say, I'm moving this weekend, will you help me? You wouldn't do it. I'm guessing you wouldn't do it, okay? Maybe you're all nicer than me. I wouldn't do it, okay? Now think about this. If our future self is like another person, like a stranger, what obligation do we have to do anything for their benefit? Eat the salad tonight instead of the steak? Who cares about that future guy's waistline, right? That's not me, that's some other person. Like, save rather than spend. Why should I do that? That's somebody else, right? Anytime we get focused on the present rather than the future, we can say, well, it's not that rational to think about the future if our future self is another person. There's one caveat here. And the caveat is that we don't treat everyone in our lives like that coworker you barely know. Right? Who do we make sacrifices for? We make them for our kids, like all the time. Right? Our spouses, our aging parents, our closest friends. And so the idea that I've really been exploring is that, yeah, everybody thinks of our future selves as if they're other people, but what matters is the nature of the relationship that you have with that other person. So if you feel a sense of overlap and you feel a sense of connection, then you'll be more likely to do things today for their benefit. And if you don't, well, you won't. And so over the years, I've been exploring this. So we've asked thousands of people. These are with my students here at Anderson, as well as my collaborators who are all over. We've asked thousands of people about the relationships they have with their future selves. How close do they feel? How connected? How much emotional overlap? And what we've found across a lot of studies is the more connected people feel, the more likely they are to save, and the more likely they are to exercise, the more likely they are to take the ethical path when given the option for an unethical one, because after all, that's another present-future trade-off. We even found that they're more satisfied with their lives 10 years after they've been initially asked. And this is when you take into account all sorts of other things that might matter for these types of decisions. Now, the real question, of course, is how do we end up befriending our future selves? How do we bring them closer to us? So I'm going to give you a couple of options here. These are like teasers, if you will, okay? So I teach the core marketing class, so I'm like hesitant to be like, if you want to know more, you've got to read the book, you got to buy the book, but that is kind of what I'm doing. Okay, so I'll give you 3 teasers here, all right? The first one is to make the future self closer. All right, what does that mean? Let's think about this for a second. Consider how we get people to take better care of others. And what I mean by that is, let's get specific. Think about how charities get you to donate to charity recipients. What do? They tell stories. Who said that? They tell stories. I thought you were going to say they give tax write-offs, but they tell stories, right? They make the recipients vivid. Stories and vivid examples, those are emotional. And things that are emotional drive behavior. So my colleagues and I said, how can we make the future self more vivid to make it more emotional? Because anytime anyone who's ever sat through a session with a financial advisor and they show you that compound interest chart, to them that's emotional. To many other people, it's just a graph. And so we thought, well, how do we make the future self more vivid? So here's what we decided to do. Over the years, we said, you know what, let's try to show people their future selves. This is just one possibility. And now when I started this is before AI took off like it is today. Has someone said AI in every talk today? Okay, there you go. Check it off the box, okay? This is before that. So we were doing this kind of like, with our own software engineers and graphic artists. And so you'd have to take a picture of someone's face and it had to be a neutral expression, not expressing any positive or negative emotion. So here is my neutral picture. Thank you. I think you can agree that it's not that neutral. I'm scary, I know. Okay. And we turn that into a digital avatar. All right, that's my computerized version. And then what we'd want to do, because we wanted to confront people with their future selves, we would apply an age progression algorithm. What's an age progression algorithm? It's exactly what it sounds like. It does to the face what aging does to the face. You ready for this list of things? It sags the cheeks here, makes the ears bigger, and grays your hair, and some age spots, etc. Okay, so here is the age progressed version of me. Okay. Thank you, thank you. I don't know why that's so funny, as if that won't happen. So this is the real version, right? My wife thinks this is overly optimistic. Now, of course, you can do this way better, right? FaceApp, Snapchat, I don't work with any of these companies. You can use them and make a much better version. Now, here's the point, though. I'm going to turn that off. There we go. Here's the point. We would show people these images. We did it in virtual reality. We've done it online. We've worked with big banks to do this. And when people are exposed to their future selves, they intend to, and then they do, save more money for the long term. Okay? These are not massive effects. I just want to be clear. Like I said, I'm in marketing. Some of you are probably too. Some of you have tried to change consumer behavior. It's not easy to change consumer behavior. But they give rise to small effects that do change and add up over time. So that's just one example of ways that we can make the future self closer. The other bucket is what I call making life easier for the present self. And what I mean by that is, how can we figure out ways to make present-day sacrifices feel easier to make? There's this great quote from Groucho Marx where he says, "What have future generations ever done for us?" You get it, right? And so basically, anytime we're talking about these trade-offs over time, it's me now who has to make the sacrifice and some future guy who benefits. That's not a good equation there, right? So how can we make that sacrifice feel easier? I'll give you one example of this. This is with another Anderson professor, Shlomo Benartzi, and Steve Shu, who's now at Cornell. We partnered with Acorns. Acorns is a fintech app, Southern California. And it's mostly caters to millennials, above median income. These are people who want to save, okay? And so for 2 weeks, every single new user who signed up got the option to then also sign up for an automatic savings account. Money would be taken out of their checking account into their savings account. Now, we decided to do something a little bit, I don't know if this is tricky or not, but we asked one group of people if they wanted to save $150 a month. We asked another if they wanted to save $35 a week, and we asked a final group if they wanted to save $5 a day. Okay, you don't have to have remembered any of your principles of finance for this one, right? Like, you know what's going on here. These are the same amounts, okay? The difference psychologically is that this one over here, maybe you can't see it, the $5 a day feels a lot easier to make, right? $150 a month to these users, it's hard to think of something I can give up for $150 a month. It's easier to think about something I can give up for $5 a day. So I'll show you what we found. Turns out about 7% sign up when it's $150 a month. That's actually a lot, but don't forget, these are kind of warm leads. These are people who want to save. It's more when it's $35 a week, but what we were surprised by is that about 4 times as many sign up when it's $5 a day. Now, I want to be clear. After a month, some of those people dropped off, probably because they were like, oh my God, this is $150 a month. But even though there was drop off after a month, still so many more were enrolled than would have been had we started with the more psychologically difficult framing, okay? So that's just one example of, let's think about ways that we can make present-day sacrifices feel easier. And then the final example I want to talk about is what I call staying the course. And this stems from the realization that we have our current self and we have our future self and we have the best laid plans for our future self. But who always messes it up? Current self, right? And so staying the course means that we're aware of the fact that we may screw things up. My favorite example of this is a guy named Dave Krippendorf. He was an MIT grad student. He lived across from a Whole Foods, and he'd always go snack there. And then he realized, I gotta lock this stuff up. So he created what's called the kitchen safe, which is a safe you put in your kitchen, and it goes from a minute to 10 days, and you can lock things away in it. And he launched it, and he went on Shark Tank, and he got super successful, and he dropped his regular job and does this full time now. Found out that so many people were using this not for kitchen things, but for other stuff. Like alcohol or drugs or anything else they wanted to get their hands away from, so he renamed it K-Safe. And I said, can I get one? And he said, what are you going to use it for? And I said, my phone. And he said, I'm going to give you the opaque box. You don't want the clear one, because then you can see right through it. And I use this at night often, especially when I'm about to have dinner with my kids and I don't want to get distracted. If you're curious, by the way, there's another website that's great for this called stick.com, where you can make commitments to things. Like, say I want to work out 4 days a week. I would make a commitment to do that. I would say, I'm going to get an accountability partner. It'll be Jill. Jill's going to call me each week and say, did you work out 4 days a week? And I'm going to have to be honest with her. I'm trying to do this for myself. By the way, I've also given it my credit card and the name of an anti-charity, as in, let's say, a political organization I don't want to donate to. You don't need to fill in the gaps there, okay? And it allows you to stay committed to your goals there. All right, so those are just a couple of the examples. Now, yes, it sounds scary, but you've got to have a strong accountability partner there. All right, so I told you I'd return to Greg, the guy with the tattoo. He wasn't the only, by the way, I should say, he wasn't the only Bay Area person I talked to. I also talked to this guy, BJ Miller. He's this incredibly kind and compassionate palliative care doctor in the Bay Area. He's like changing the way that Americans think about the end of their lives. And I decided to talk to him because, after all, if I'm interested in long-term plans, this is about as long-term as you can get. It goes beyond that, really. And I said, who makes the worst plans? When do things go wrong? And he said, it's not the people who don't plan. It's the people who do, but then get surprised when things don't turn out the way that they expected. And he said, the wisest people, the wisest patients are ones who, sure, they plan for the future, but they also recognize that they can feel differently about those plans as time progresses. So I caught up with Greg, having all this in mind, and I was like, Greg, I have to ask you, did you regret getting the tattoo? This is him. You can barely see it, it's faded, it's like 30 years old. And his answer was so clear. He said, absolutely not. I don't regret it for an instant. And I was like, why? And he said, the person I was then, it's different than who I am now. You know, I was carefree. I could stay out late. I could eat burritos multiple days a week. And like, that's not him now. He's in the corporate world. He can't stay up late, all those things. But he said, every time I look at my arm, I can connect back to that person. So I think in a way, he's like the wisest of those palliative care patients. He knows that he's changed from who he was to who he is now. And in my conversation, I think it was clear that he knows he'll also continue to change as well. So I think if there's a final way to think about how we can befriend our future selves, it's to treat them like we treat our closest friends, knowing that we can stay connected to them even when the changes, whether they're small or big, occur to us. All right, I'm going to stop there. As Jill said, I have this book coming out that digs into all of this. I think that's been clear. There's a picture of the book. You can pre-order it now. The rave reviews are in, things like, this is great and you're a wonderful son. I love the cover, daddy, those sorts of things, you know? So, but in all seriousness, thank you so much for listening today, and thank you for being part of Anderson. This is the community that's allowed me to explore these ideas in a way that I've really loved. So thank you again, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.